Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the marble halls of ancient Rome, where ambition wore a purple cloak and death lurked behind every senator's smile. This is the story of Gaius Julius Caesar, a man whose hunger for power was so consuming, so relentless, that it lifted him to the very pinnacle of the known world, only to cast him down in a pool of his own blood on the Senate floor. Caesar's ambition wasn't just extraordinary, it was dangerous. It transformed him from a debt-ridden young aristocrat into the most powerful man alive. But it also made his assassination not just possible, but inevitable. Tonight, we'll walk the path of a man who refused to accept limits, who crushed every obstacle in his way, and who, in reaching for immortality, ensured his own destruction. Before we cross the Rubicon and witness history's most dramatic rise and fall, tell me in the comments where across this empire of viewers you're watching from, and what hour has brought you here. Are you witnessing this tale in the shadowed hours when conspirators gather, or in broad daylight when ambition shows its face? And if you want to learn the lessons that history's most powerful figures paid for with their lives, subscribe now, because understanding the past is the only way to recognize when the knives are being sharpened for tomorrow. The making of a monster. Rome in the 1st century before Christ was a city drunk on its own success. The republic that had started as a modest collection of tribes along the Tiber had devoured the Mediterranean world, growing fat on conquest and plunder. But success, as Caesar would learn, bred both opportunity and enemies. Into this world of marble and blood was born Gaius Julius Caesar on July 12th, 100 BC, into a family that claimed descent from Venus herself. The Iuli were old patrician stock, their bloodline running back to the mythical founder of Troy. But noble blood didn't guarantee wealth or power in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. Caesar's family was respectable, but hardly rich, hardly influential. His father had reached the praetorship, a decent achievement, but far from the consulship that represented true power. Young Caesar grew up watching more successful families parade their triumphs through the streets while his own clan struggled to maintain relevance. But if Caesar lacked wealth, he possessed something far more dangerous, an absolute refusal to accept second place. From his earliest years, those who knew him detected something unsettling in his ambition. Where other young aristocrats were content to follow the traditional path of Roman advancement, the cursus honorum Caesar seemed to view every step not as an achievement but as an inadequate prelude to something greater. His first taste of real danger came not from war but from marriage. At 19, Caesar married Cornelia, daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a powerful supporter of the radical General Marius. This wasn't just a romantic choice, it was a political statement that nearly cost him his life. When Sulla, Marius's bitter enemy, returned to Rome with his legions and began his bloody purges, Caesar found himself on the wrong side of history. Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia and break his ties to the populist faction. Any reasonable young man would have complied, saving his skin and his future prospects. But Caesar, barely 20 years old, refused. He fled Rome rather than abandon his wife, spending months hiding in the Italian countryside while Sulla's death squads hunted down his enemies. Here was the first glimpse of a pattern that would define his entire life. When faced with a choice between safety and principle, between survival and ambition, Caesar always chose the path that led toward power, regardless of the immediate cost. Sulla eventually pardoned the young Caesar, reportedly saying, "In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses." It was meant as a warning, an acknowledgement of the dangerous potential he saw in the young man. Sulla, who had clawed his way to absolute power. Through rivers of blood, recognized a kindred spirit. He saw in Caesar's refusal to bow, even when faced with death, the same relentless hunger that had driven his own rise too. Dictatorship. Caesar's early career followed a predictable pattern of slow advancement, interrupted by spectacular risks. He served as a young officer in Asia Minor, where he earned the civic crown, Rome's highest military honor, for saving a fellow soldier's life. But even this early recognition wasn't enough to satisfy his hunger. While other young men his age were content to enjoy their youth, Caesar was already calculating his path to the top of Roman society. Money, Caesar realized, was the foundation of all power in Rome. Without wealth, political advancement was impossible. The problem was that Caesar had no wealth, and the positions available to young aristocrats paid little or nothing. So Caesar did what many ambitious Romans did. He borrowed, not modest sums for reasonable expenses, but staggering amounts that would either elevate him to the heights where he could repay them, or destroy him completely. By his early 30s, Caesar's debts were legendary. Plutarch claims he owed 31 million denarii before holding any major office, an almost incomprehensible sum that would have bankrupted lesser men. His creditors included some of Rome's most powerful financiers, men who could have destroyed him with a word. But Caesar understood something crucial about debt. If you owe a small amount, you have a problem. If you owe an enormous amount, your creditors have a problem. His debts became a form of insurance, binding Rome's financial elite to his success. Caesar used this borrowed fortune to fund the most spectacular displays Rome had ever seen. As aedile in 65 BC, responsible for public games and festivals, he bankrupted himself putting on shows that left the city gasping. His gladiatorial games featured 320 pairs of fighters, an unprecedented number that violated Senate regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of popular manipulation. His theatrical productions, his public feasts, his elaborate decorations of the Forum, all were calculated to burn his name into the consciousness of the Roman people. But spectacle was only one weapon in Caesar's arsenal. He understood that in Rome, popularity with the masses could trump senatorial opposition, and he cultivated that popularity with the skill of a master craftsman. Unlike the old aristocrats who viewed the common people with barely concealed contempt, Caesar spoke to them as equals, remembered their names, inquired about their families. He walked among them without guards, ate in their taverns, listened to their complaints. This wasn't mere political calculation, though calculation certainly played a part. Caesar genuinely understood that the people of Rome were the source of all legitimate power, that the Senate's authority ultimately rested on popular consent. His rise through the lower magistracies was marked by controversy and scandal, always carefully calculated to enhance his reputation rather than diminish it. When he served as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, he turned the position from a ceremonial honor into a platform for political theater. When he governed further Spain as praetor, he used the position not just to enrich himself and pay down his debts, but to demonstrate his military capabilities against the local tribes. Each success bred new ambitions. Each achievement revealed new possibilities. By the time Caesar returned from Spain in 60 BC, he had established himself as one of Rome's most promising leaders. But promising wasn't enough, not for a man who believed himself destined for greatness. Caesar looked around at the Roman political landscape and saw opportunity everywhere. In the jealousies between rival generals, in the Senate's inability to address Rome's growing problems, in the people's hunger for leadership that actually served their interests. What he needed was a vehicle to transform his popularity and talent into real power. That vehicle would come in the form of an alliance that would shake the Roman world to its foundations. The first triumvirate, a deal with devils. Rome's political system was designed to prevent exactly what Caesar craved, the concentration of power in a single pair of hands. The Republic's elaborate checks and balances, its term limits, and divided authorities all served to ensure that no individual could dominate the state as the ancient kings had done. But systems designed by men can be circumvented by men clever enough to find their weaknesses. Caesar found his opportunity in the frustrations of two of Rome's most powerful men, Gnaeus Pompey, the great general who had conquered the East, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Both had reached the pinnacle of legitimate achievement. Both had been consuls. Both commanded enormous influence. But both had discovered that the Senate, jealous of their power and suspicious of their ambitions, could block their most cherished projects. Pompey had returned from his eastern campaigns, having added vast territories to Rome's empire, having filled the treasury with unprecedented wealth, having demonstrated military genius on a scale not seen since Alexander the Great. But the Senate, terrified of his power, refused to ratify his eastern settlement or grant land to his veterans. For a man who had reshaped the map of the world, this petty obstruction was intolerable. Crassus faced similar frustrations. Despite his immense wealth, despite his crucial role in suppressing Spartacus's slave rebellion, despite his political connections, he found himself consistently overshadowed by Pompey's military glory. Crassus understood that in Rome, military achievement trumped every other accomplishment, and he burned with desire for a command that would allow him to prove himself Pompey's equal. Caesar saw in their frustrations an opportunity to leapfrog the traditional stages of Roman advancement. Instead of spending decades slowly climbing the ladder of officers, he could ally himself with these titans and use their power to accelerate his own rise. The alliance he proposed was breathtaking in its audacity. The three most ambitious men in Rome would pool their resources and influence to dominate the state completely. The first triumvirate, as historians would later call it, was formed in secret in 60 BC. It wasn't a formal legal arrangement, but a private agreement between three men who understood that the Roman system could no longer contain their ambitions. They would support each other's goals, share the profits of power, and present a united front against all opposition. Caesar would be elected consul and receive a major provincial command. Pompey would see his eastern settlement ratified and his veterans settled. Crassus would receive the support necessary for his own military ambitions to seal the alliance. Caesar offered Pompey something more valuable than gold: his daughter Julia in marriage. The match joined Rome's greatest general to Caesar's bloodline, creating family bonds that would make betrayal more difficult and more costly. Julia was young, beautiful, and intelligent, but more importantly, she was Caesar's ticket into the inner circle of Roman power. The triumvirate's first test came with Caesar's bid for the consulship in 59 BC. His opponents, backed by conservative senators who suspected his intentions, threw everything they had against him. They spread rumors about his debts, his radical associations, his secret agreements with Pompey and Crassus. But Caesar had learned the lessons of Roman politics well. Money and popularity could overcome aristocratic opposition. His election campaign was a masterpiece of political theater. While his opponents appealed to tradition and constitutional propriety, Caesar appealed directly to the people's desires and needs. He promised land for veterans, grain subsidies for the urban poor, debt relief for struggling farmers. His rallies drew enormous crowds. His promises struck at the heart of Rome's real problems. When the votes were counted, Caesar had won decisively, carrying not just the urban tribes, but many of the rural constituencies that traditionally supported conservative candidates. But winning the consulship was only the beginning, as Caesar took office in January 59 BC. He faced a Senate determined to limit his power and a co-consul, Marcus Bibulus, chosen specifically to oppose him. The conservatives' strategy was simple: use constitutional procedures to frustrate Caesar's agenda until his year in office ended, and he could be prosecuted for his irregularities. Caesar's response revealed the full scope of his ambition and his willingness to shatter precedent when it served his purposes. When Bibulus attempted to veto his legislation, Caesar simply ignored him. When the Senate refused to debate his proposals, he took them directly to the popular assembly. When traditional procedures proved inadequate, he used Pompey's veterans to intimidate opponents and force through his agenda. The year 59 BC marked the death of the Roman Republic in all but name. Caesar's consulship demonstrated that the elaborate constitutional framework that had governed Rome for centuries could be swept aside by a determined individual with sufficient popular support and military backing. Bibulus, powerless to stop Caesar's legislative steamroller, withdrew to his house and issued impotent edicts that the people ignored. Wags in Rome joked that it was not the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar. Caesar's legislation transformed Rome's political landscape. His land bill settled Pompey's veterans while winning the loyalty of thousands of new landowners. His ratification of Pompey's eastern settlement brought vast wealth into the treasury while demonstrating the triumvirate's power to reward friends and punish enemies. His judicial reforms attacked the power of the old aristocratic families while expanding opportunities for Caesar's own supporters. But perhaps most importantly, Caesar secured for himself the command that would make him a household name across the ancient world: the governorship of Gaul. This wasn't just any provincial assignment, but a 5-year command over territories that stretched from the Mediterranean to the English Channel, populated by fierce tribes who had never bowed to Roman rule. For most governors, such an assignment would be a dangerous burden. For Caesar, it was exactly the opportunity he had been seeking. The Gallic command offered everything Caesar needed: the chance to win military glory that would rival Pompey's achievements, the opportunity to enrich himself and his supporters with the spoils of conquest, and the time to build a veteran army personally loyal to him rather than to the Roman state. As he prepared to leave for Gaul, Caesar understood that he was embarking on the most crucial phase of his career. Success would elevate him to the first rank of Roman leaders. Failure would mean exile, impoverishment, and probably death. But failure was not a possibility Caesar allowed himself to consider. As he crossed the boundaries of Italy and entered his province, he carried with him not just the authority of Rome, but the burning ambition that had driven every decision of his life. Gaul would test that ambition in ways he could not yet imagine, forging him in the crucible of constant warfare into the man who would one day make himself master of the world. The Gallic Wars, forging a legend in blood. Gaul in 58 BC was a patchwork of Celtic tribes, some allied to Rome, others hostile, all proud and warlike. The region roughly encompassed modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland, populated by perhaps 3 million people organized into dozens of distinct tribal confederations. These were not primitive barbarians, but sophisticated societies with their own laws, customs, and military traditions. They had fortified cities, extensive trade networks, and warrior cultures that had resisted Roman expansion for generations. Caesar arrived in his province to find a crisis tailor-made for his ambitions. The Helvetii, a Swiss tribe facing pressure from Germanic incursions, had decided to migrate westward through Roman territory to settle in Gaul. Their movement threatened to destabilize the entire region, potentially bringing hundreds of thousands of refugees and warriors into conflict with Rome's Gallic allies. A cautious governor might have negotiated, seeking a diplomatic solution that avoided bloodshed while protecting Roman interests. But Caesar was not cautious, and he understood that his political future depended on military success. The Helvetii migration offered him the perfect pretext for a war that could establish his reputation and enrich his coffers. Caesar's first campaign revealed the military genius that would make him one of history's greatest generals. The Helvetii were brave and numerous, but they were also burdened by their families and possessions, moving slowly across unfamiliar territory. Caesar used his legions' superior mobility and discipline to harass their march, forcing them into a desperate battle at Bibracte, where superior Roman tactics and equipment decided the day. The victory over the Helvetii was just the beginning. Word of Caesar's success spread throughout Gaul, creating both opportunities and threats. Some tribes sought Roman alliance, hoping to use Caesar's legions against their traditional enemies. Others recognized the danger Caesar represented and began forming coalitions to resist further Roman expansion. Caesar welcomed both reactions. Allied tribes provided intelligence, supplies, and auxiliary troops for his campaigns. Enemy coalitions gave him justification for new wars and new conquests. Throughout his Gallic campaigns, Caesar demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to turn every development to his advantage, transforming setbacks into opportunities and victories into stepping stones to greater triumphs. His war against the Germanic king Ariovistus showcased Caesar's tactical brilliance and his understanding of psychological warfare. Ariovistus had crossed the Rhine with a large Germanic host, threatening Rome's Gallic allies and potentially establishing Germanic settlement in Gaul. The king was reputedly 7 feet tall, commanded fierce warriors who had never known defeat, and claimed divine protection from the Germanic gods. Caesar's own soldiers were terrified. Germanic warriors were legendary for their size and ferocity, and many of Caesar's legions were relatively inexperienced troops raised for the Gallic command. Some officers even wrote their wills before the battle, convinced they were marching to their deaths. But Caesar understood that confidence was as important as tactics in determining military outcomes. He addressed his troops with a speech that combined practical reassurance with appeals to Roman pride and personal loyalty. He reminded them of their training, their equipment advantages, and their recent victories. More importantly, he made it clear that their fate was tied to his own. Victory would bring them wealth and glory. Defeat would destroy them all. The battle against Ariovistus was Caesar's first great test as a field commander. Germanic warriors attacked with terrifying fury, their war cries echoing across the battlefield as they charged the Roman lines. But Caesar's formations held, his tactics prevailed, and Ariovistus's army was shattered. The Germanic king fled back across the Rhine, his reputation for invincibility destroyed, his threat to Gaul eliminated. More importantly, Caesar had demonstrated to his soldiers that he was not just a political leader but a general they could follow into any battle. The victory over Ariovistus transformed Caesar's relationship with his legions from formal command to personal devotion. These men had seen their general share their dangers, had watched him turn seemingly hopeless situations into triumphs, had benefited from his victories with plunder and promotions. Year after year, Caesar extended Roman power deeper into Gaul. His campaigns followed a consistent pattern: intelligence gathering to identify threats and opportunities, rapid movement to achieve strategic surprise, decisive battles that shattered enemy resistance, and generous treatment of defeated enemies to prevent future rebellions. He fought the Belgae, the fiercest of the Gallic tribes, crushing their coalition. At the Sabis River, through personal courage and tactical flexibility, he crossed the Rhine twice, demonstrating Roman power to the Germanic tribes and establishing Rome's dominance over a river that had previously marked the limits of civilized conquest. Perhaps most dramatically, Caesar crossed the English Channel to invade Britain, a mysterious island at the edge of the known world. The Channel crossing was a logistical nightmare, requiring specially constructed ships and careful timing to avoid the treacherous tides. Many Romans considered Britain a mythical place inhabited by painted savages and ruled by druids who practiced human sacrifice. Caesar's British expeditions were more show than substance, brief incursions designed to enhance his reputation rather than establish permanent conquest. But the psychological impact was enormous. Caesar had led Roman eagles beyond the boundaries of the world itself, had dared what no general before him had attempted. Reports of his British campaign spread throughout the Mediterranean, establishing him as a general whose ambitions knew no limits. But Caesar's greatest test came in 52 BC, when the Gallic tribes united under Vercingetorix, a young Arverni noble who understood that divided resistance meant eventual defeat. Vercingetorix was everything Caesar was not: a native leader fighting for his homeland, commanding warriors motivated by patriotism rather than profit, employing guerrilla tactics designed to neutralize Roman advantages in equipment and discipline. The Gallic rebellion caught Caesar at a disadvantage. He was in Italy when it began, attending to political business, leaving his legions scattered in winter quarters across Gaul. Vercingetorix's strategy was brilliant: avoid pitched battles where Roman discipline gave them the advantage, attack Roman supply lines to starve their armies, use the countryside's familiarity to strike and disappear before retaliation was possible. For months, the rebellion raged across Gaul. Roman outposts were overwhelmed, supply convoys ambushed, isolated garrisons besieged. Caesar found himself fighting not a conventional war against tribal armies, but an insurgency that threatened to undo 8 years of conquest. His communications with Rome were cut, his supply situation desperate, his political enemies already celebrating his anticipated downfall. The decisive moment came at Alesia, an Gallic fortress positioned on an impregnable hilltop where Vercingetorix had concentrated his forces. Caesar's decision to besiege Alesia was either military genius or desperate gamble, depending on perspective. He couldn't storm the fortress directly, but a prolonged siege would give Gallic relief forces time to organize and trap his legions between the fortress and an external army. Caesar's solution demonstrated the engineering skill that made Roman legions feared throughout the ancient world. He built not one, but 2 sets of fortifications: an inner wall to contain the fortress and prevent breakouts, an outer wall to protect his own forces from external attack. His soldiers worked around the clock for weeks, creating the most elaborate military engineering project since the Trojan War. The siege of Alesia became a race against time. Vercingetorix's forces were slowly starving within the fortress, while Caesar's legions faced the prospect of fighting a two-front battle against overwhelming odds. When the Gallic relief army finally arrived, Caesar found himself trapped between 60,000 warriors in the fortress and perhaps 100,000 more surrounding his outer fortifications. The final battle at Alesia was Caesar's masterpiece, a tactical symphony that demonstrated every aspect of his military genius. Attacked simultaneously from inside and outside his fortifications, Caesar used his interior lines to shift forces rapidly between threatened sectors. When the situation became desperate, he personally led his cavalry in a charge that shattered the relief army and broke the siege. Vercingetorix's surrender marked the end of organized Gallic resistance and the completion of Caesar's transformation. From politician to legend, the young noble who had united Gaul against Rome now threw down his arms at Caesar's feet, accepting captivity to spare his followers further bloodshed. Caesar treated his defeated enemy with respect, understanding that Vercingetorix's courage had enhanced rather than diminished Roman victory. The Gallic wars had accomplished everything Caesar intended and more. He had conquered territory larger than Italy itself, adding perhaps 1 million new subjects to Rome's empire. He had captured enough gold and slaves to pay off his enormous debts and fund future political campaigns. Most importantly, he had forged his legions into the most formidable military force in the ancient world. Soldiers whose loyalty belonged to Caesar personally rather than to the Roman state. But success in Gaul created new problems in Rome. Caesar's achievements had elevated him to Pompey's level as a general, threatening the balance that had held the triumvirate together. His wealth rivaled Crassus's. His popularity exceeded both his partners. His veteran legions were more experienced and better led than any other Roman army. The alliance that had lifted Caesar to power was now constraining his further ambitions. Caesar prepared to return from Gaul. He faced a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of Rome itself. He could accept the limitations of the republican system, dismiss his legions, and return to Rome as a private citizen vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies. Or he could use the power he had built in Gaul to claim what he believed he had earned: dominance over the Roman world. The choice, for a man of Caesar's ambition, was never really in doubt. As he stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between his Gallic command and Italy proper, Caesar understood that he had reached the moment when ambition and survival became indistinguishable. Behind him lay 8 years of conquest and glory. Ahead lay either supreme power or complete destruction. There could be no middle ground for Julius Caesar. The die is cast. Civil war and absolute power. The Rubicon was a small river, hardly worth noticing under normal circumstances. But in January 49 BC, it represented the most important boundary in the Roman world, the line between Caesar's lawful command in Gaul and the sacred territory of Italy, where no general could bring his legions without Senate authorization. To cross the Rubicon with his army would be an act of war against the Roman state itself. Caesar stood on its banks with a single legion, the 13th veterans of 8 years of Gallic warfare, who had followed him from the Atlantic to the Rhine. These men had made him rich, had made him famous, had transformed him from a detritus politician into one of Rome's most successful generals. Now he was asking them to make him something more, either master of Rome or the most notorious traitor in republican history. The political situation that had driven Caesar to this moment was largely of his own making. The triumvirate that had elevated him had collapsed under the weight of its own success. Crassus had died in Parthia, his army destroyed, his head used as a prop in a theatrical performance by the Parthian king. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had died in childbirth, severing the family bonds that had held the alliance together. Without these connections, the natural rivalry between Caesar and Pompey had reasserted itself with devastating consequences. Pompey had allowed himself to be drawn into alliance with Caesar's senatorial enemies, the same conservatives who had opposed Caesar's consulship and resented his Gallic achievements. They painted Caesar as a tyrant in the making, a new Sulla who would use military force to dominate the state. Pompey, jealous of Caesar's recent successes and nervous about his own position, had gradually accepted their arguments and their support. The Senate's demands were simple but impossible for Caesar to accept. He must dismiss his legions, return to Rome as a private citizen, and stand trial for the alleged illegalities of his consulship 10 years earlier. Caesar's enemies made no secret of their intentions. They would prosecute him for bribery, for constitutional violations, for abuse of power. Conviction would mean exile, confiscation of property, and political death. For most men, the choice would have been agonizing. Caesar had achieved more than any Roman of his generation. He could have retired to his estates, written his memoirs, enjoyed the wealth and prestige his victories had earned. But Caesar was not most men, and retirement was not in his vocabulary. He had tasted supreme command, had experienced the intoxication of reshaping the world through force of will. To voluntarily surrender that power, to place himself at the mercy of lesser men who had achieved nothing comparable to his own feats, was psychologically impossible. Caesar's famous words as he crossed the Rubicon, "The die is cast," reflected not just his decision but his character. He had spent his entire career taking calculated risks, betting everything on his ability to triumph through a combination of courage, intelligence, and luck. The civil war he was about to unleash would be the greatest gamble of his life, with stakes that included not just his own survival but the future of Roman civilization. The speed of Caesar's initial advance caught his enemies completely off guard. They had expected him to spend months preparing for civil war, giving them time to organize resistance and rally support. Instead, Caesar struck like lightning, his veteran legions moving faster than anyone thought possible. Within days, he had seized control of northern Italy, capturing supplies, recruiting reinforcements, and demonstrating that the war would not be won through defensive measures. Pompey's response revealed both his strategic wisdom and his fatal hesitation. He understood that Caesar's advantages lay in the experience of his veterans and the momentum of early success. Given time, Pompey could assemble superior forces from Rome's eastern provinces and use his command of the sea to strangle Caesar's supply lines. But time required trading space, abandoning Rome itself to concentrate forces elsewhere. The decision to evacuate Rome was strategically sound but politically disastrous. To ordinary Romans, Pompey's retreat looked like cowardice, abandoning the city to an invading enemy. Caesar's propaganda machine, honed during years of Gallic dispatches, exploited this perception ruthlessly. Caesar presented himself not as a rebel but as a liberator, coming to free Rome from an oligarchy that cared more for their own power than for the people's welfare. Caesar's clemency toward defeated enemies became a crucial weapon in the civil war. Unlike Sulla's brutal prescriptions, Caesar pardoned opponents who submitted, often retaining them in their positions and treating them with respect. This policy served multiple purposes. It encouraged defections from Pompey's cause, demonstrated Caesar's confidence in ultimate victory, and created a moral contrast with the bloodthirsty reputation of previous civil wars. But clemency was also a calculated political strategy. Caesar understood that he could not rule Rome through terror alone. The Republic's survival depended on the cooperation of the senatorial class, and wholesale slaughter of his opponents would make stable government impossible. By demonstrating mercy, Caesar hoped to convince his enemies that submission was preferable to continued resistance. The pursuit of Pompey across the Mediterranean became an epic chase spanning 3 continents. Pompey had withdrawn to Greece, gathering legions from the eastern provinces and building a massive army that outnumbered Caesar's forces 2 to 1. But numbers meant little if they could not be properly supplied and commanded, and Pompey's heterogeneous force lacked the cohesion and experience of Caesar's Gallic veterans. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus in 48 BC, a clash that would determine the fate of the Roman world. Pompey commanded perhaps 47,000 men, including some of Rome's most distinguished officers and allied contingents from across the eastern Mediterranean. Caesar had only about 22,000 soldiers, but they were seasoned professionals who had followed him. Through 8 years of continuous warfare, Caesar's tactical brilliance showed itself in his battle deployment. Understanding that Pompey's cavalry superiority could roll up his right flank, Caesar concealed a special reserve behind his main line, soldiers armed with javelins and trained to target the horses rather than riders. When Pompey's cavalry charged, expecting to sweep away Caesar's outnumbered horsemen, they met a wall of steel that shattered their attack and turned triumph into rout. The Battle of Pharsalus was over almost before it began. Pompey's infantry, seeing their cavalry destroyed and Caesar's veterans advancing with irresistible momentum, broke and fled. Pompey himself, the great general who had conquered the East, abandoned his army and fled toward Egypt, hoping to rebuild his forces with Ptolemaic support. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus established his military supremacy, but it also created new challenges. He now controlled Rome and its western provinces, but Pompey's supporters still held much of the eastern Mediterranean. More importantly, Caesar had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He was no longer fighting to defend his dignity or protect himself from prosecution. He was fighting for mastery of the Roman world, and that mastery would require the complete destruction of the republican system that had created him. The pursuit of Pompey to Egypt revealed both Caesar's ruthlessness and his political sophistication. When he arrived in Alexandria to find that Pompey had been murdered by Ptolemaic courtiers seeking to curry favor, Caesar reportedly wept at the sight of his rival's severed head. Whether his grief was genuine or theatrical, the gesture served important purposes. It demonstrated that Caesar's quarrel had been with Pompey personally, not with his memory or his supporters. It also established Caesar as a man of honor who respected worthy enemies. Caesar's Egyptian adventure nearly ended his career before it had properly begun. Seduced by Cleopatra's intelligence and ambition as much as her beauty, Caesar became entangled in Ptolemaic dynastic politics that culminated in the siege of Alexandria. For months, the man who had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey found himself trapped in the Egyptian capital. His small force besieged by vastly superior numbers and cut off from reinforcement. The siege of Alexandria demonstrated both Caesar's military genius and his incredible luck. Outnumbered and surrounded, he used his soldiers' engineering skills to fortify strategic positions while his naval forces controlled the harbor. When relief finally arrived, Caesar's breakout was so swift and devastating that his Egyptian enemies were completely routed. The campaign that had seemed like folly ended with Caesar as effective ruler of Egypt and Cleopatra as his grateful ally. But while Caesar dallied in Egypt, his enemies were regrouping. Pompey's sons had raised new legions in Spain. Cato and other Republican diehards were building resistance in Africa, and various eastern kingdoms were choosing sides in anticipation of renewed warfare. Caesar's clemency, admirable as a political gesture, had allowed many of his opponents to escape and organize fresh opposition. The African campaign of 46 BC proved to be one of Caesar's most difficult victories. His opponents had learned from Phasaelus, avoiding pitched battles and using superior local knowledge to frustrate Caesar's attempts at decisive engagement. The presence of Cato among his enemies also gave them a moral authority that purely military opposition lacked. Cato's reputation for integrity and devotion to republican principles made him a powerful symbol of resistance to Caesar's ambitions. The Battle of Thapsus finally broke Republican resistance in Africa, but the victory came at a terrible cost to Caesar's reputation for clemency. His veterans, frustrated by months of inconclusive campaigning and losses to guerrilla warfare, massacred defeated enemies despite Caesar's orders to spare them. The slaughter at Thapsus showed that even Caesar could not completely control forces he had unleashed. That civil war created its own momentum toward brutality and revenge. Cato's suicide, rather than submission to Caesar's clemency, was perhaps the most damaging blow to Caesar's political position. The old Stoic chose death over life under a tyrant, and his self-destruction became a powerful indictment of Caesar's rule. Caesar had wanted to pardon Cato, to demonstrate that even his most principled opponents could find honor under his government. Instead, Cato's death became a rallying cry for everyone who believed that Caesar's rise meant the end of Roman liberty. The final campaign against Pompey's sons in Spain was almost an anticlimax. By 45 BC, Caesar's military superiority was so overwhelming that resistance seemed futile. Yet the campaign proved surprisingly difficult, partly because of improved enemy tactics, but mainly because Caesar's own forces were war-weary and increasingly reluctant to fight fellow Romans. The Battle of Munda was Caesar's hardest-fought victory, won only when he personally led his reserve into combat to prevent his line from breaking. With the defeat of Pompey's sons, organized military resistance to Caesar's rule effectively ended. He returned to Rome as undisputed master of the Roman world, holding multiple consulships and dictatorships that gave him powers unprecedented in republican history. But military victory had not solved Caesar's fundamental problem: how to transform temporary dominance into permanent, legitimate rule. Caesar's solution was characteristically ambitious and dangerous. Rather than work within the existing system, he would create a new one with himself as its permanent head. He would be not just dictator, but monarch, not just first citizen, but living god. The ambition that had carried him from detraden young aristocrat to master of the Mediterranean would now attempt to reshape Roman civilization itself. But in reaching for immortality, Caesar had forgotten the lesson of his own rise, that in a system built on ambition and competition, no position was ever truly secure. The same qualities that had made him Rome's greatest general, the same relentless hunger for supremacy that had carried him from the banks of the Rubicon to the throne of the world, had also made him the most dangerous man alive to everyone around. Him, the dictator's dilemma. Power without limits. Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BC, not as a conquering hero, but as something far more dangerous, a man who had transcended the very system that created him. His triumph through the streets of the capital was magnificent beyond anything Rome had ever witnessed. 4 separate processions celebrated his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Africa, and Spain. Golden statues, captured treasures, exotic animals, and thousands of prisoners paraded before crowds, drunk on spectacle and plunder. But beneath the celebration lay a profound unease. Caesar's victories had been won not against foreign enemies but against fellow Romans. The men displayed in chains were not barbarian chieftains but senators and knights, citizens whose only crime had been opposing Caesar's rise. The wealth that funded these spectacular displays had been torn from Roman hands, not conquered from distant lands. Caesar understood the delicate psychology of his position. He needed to demonstrate his power while avoiding the appearance of tyranny, to reward his supporters without alienating potential allies, to establish permanent authority while maintaining the fiction of republican government. His solution was characteristically audacious. He would remake Rome in his own image, creating new institutions and new traditions that would outlast his own mortality. The dictatorship, Caesar claimed, was different from any previous emergency. Magistracy in Roman history. Traditional dictators had been appointed for specific crises, with their power automatically expiring after 6 months or upon completion of their assigned task. Caesar's dictatorship knew no such limits. He was dictator. Perpetuo, dictator for life, with authority that encompassed every aspect of Roman government and society. His reforms came with breathtaking speed and scope, as if Caesar understood that he had limited time to reshape Roman civilization. He restructured the calendar, adding 2 months to bring it into alignment with the solar year. He reformed the grain distribution system, reducing the number of recipients while ensuring more reliable supplies. He launched massive construction projects that provided employment for Rome's poor while glorifying his own achievements. Caesar's building program transformed the physical appearance of Rome itself. The new Forum, Julium, adjacent to the old Forum, Romanum, provided space for expanded commerce and government business while serving as a monument to Caesar's victories. The new Basilica, the largest building in Rome, housed law courts and commercial activities under Caesar's patronage. Everywhere a Roman looked, he would see evidence of Caesar's generosity and power. But perhaps Caesar's most revolutionary reforms concerned Roman citizenship itself. He granted citizenship to entire communities in Gaul and Spain, effectively doubling the number of Roman citizens and dramatically expanding the recruitment base for his legions. Traditional Romans viewed these grants with horror, seeing them as the destruction of what made Roman citizenship valuable and exclusive. Caesar's citizenship policies revealed the scope of his vision and the danger it represented to traditional elites. He was not just reforming Roman government, but redefining what it meant to be Roman. In Caesar's conception, Rome was not a city-state governing an empire, but the capital of a unified Mediterranean world where merit and loyalty mattered more than birth and tradition. His legislative program struck at the heart of senatorial privilege while expanding opportunities for his own supporters. Debt relief measures protected small farmers and urban workers from foreclosure, while reducing the power of traditional moneylenders. Sumptuary laws limited ostentatious display by the wealthy, while Caesar's own magnificence provided the only acceptable model for public grandeur. The colonization programs Caesar launched served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided land for his veterans, ensuring their continued loyalty while removing potential troublemakers from Rome itself. They spread Roman culture and institutions throughout the Mediterranean, creating new centers of power loyal to Caesar rather than to traditional Roman families. They demonstrated Caesar's generosity on an imperial scale, establishing his reputation as a leader who rewarded service with concrete benefits. But Caesar's reforms also revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his position. He was attempting to create a monarchy while maintaining republican institutions, to establish permanent personal rule while preserving the fiction of constitutional government. The Senate still met, magistrates were still elected, traditional ceremonies still occurred, but everyone understood that real power belonged to Caesar alone. The honors voted to Caesar by a servile Senate grew increasingly extravagant and increasingly dangerous to his political position. He was granted the right to wear triumphal dress at all public occasions, making him visually distinct from ordinary magistrates. His statues were placed among those of the gods in temples throughout the city. His image appeared on coins, breaking the tradition that only dead Romans could be so honored most ominously. Caesar was granted the title Father of his country and allowed to sit on a golden throne during Senate meetings. These honors, ostensibly signs of respect and gratitude, actually served to isolate Caesar from the very people whose cooperation he needed to govern effectively. He was becoming not just a king, but a living god, and gods do not consult with mortals about policy decisions. Caesar's personal behavior during this period suggests a man intoxicated by his own success and increasingly disconnected from political reality. He openly displayed his affair with Cleopatra, bringing the Egyptian queen to Rome and acknowledging their son Caesarion. He treated Senate meetings as formalities, sometimes not bothering to rise when senators approached him. He accepted divine honors with apparent satisfaction, seemingly oblivious to their effect on Roman sensibilities. The warning signs were everywhere, but Caesar chose to ignore them. Graffiti appeared on his statues, calling him a tyrant. Anonymous pamphlets circulated, questioning his sanity and his intentions. Even his own supporters began to distance themselves from his more extreme measures, understanding that popular patience with his rule was not unlimited. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra became particularly damaging to his reputation among traditional Romans. The Egyptian queen was everything Romans despised: a foreign monarch, a woman who ruled in her own right, a practitioner of mysterious Eastern religions that seemed to threaten Roman values. Her presence in Rome, living openly as Caesar's mistress while his wife Calpurnia was pushed into the background, violated every Roman concept of proper behavior. More dangerous still were the rumors that Caesar planned to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria or Troy, cities more centrally located for governing a Mediterranean empire. Whether these rumors were true or not, they reflected Roman fears that Caesar's vision of Rome's future did not include Rome itself as anything more than one city among many. The triumph Caesar celebrated in 46 BC for his African victory included a float depicting Cato's suicide, a tasteless display that horrified even Caesar's supporters. Cato had become a martyr to republican liberty, and mocking his death suggested that Caesar had lost all sense of proportion and political sensitivity. The crowd's hostile reaction should have warned Caesar that his popularity was not unlimited, but he seemed incapable of recognizing criticism as anything more than jealousy or ingratitude. Caesar's plans for new campaigns revealed the extent to which military success had become essential to his identity and his rule. He was preparing massive expeditions against Parthia and Dacia, wars of conquest that would surpass even his Gallic achievements. These campaigns would provide new wealth, new glory, and new victories to distract from domestic problems. They would also remove Caesar from Rome for years, leaving the city in the hands of subordinates, while he pursued immortal fame on distant battlefields. But the Parthian expedition also represented Caesar's final miscalculation. He was planning to leave Rome just as discontent with his rule was reaching dangerous levels, entrusting his position to deputies who lacked both his military genius and his popular appeal. The conspiracy that would end his life was already forming, but Caesar seemed blind to the danger, obsessed with adding new territories to his empire rather than securing his hold on territories he already controlled. As Caesar prepared for departure, he received numerous warnings of danger. Soothsayers advised against travel. His wife Calpurnia begged him to postpone the campaign. Anonymous notes warned of specific threats to his life. But Caesar had spent so many years defying odds and overcoming obstacles that he had lost the ability to distinguish between reasonable caution and cowardly superstition. The man who had crossed the Rubicon, because he understood that retreat meant destruction, was now incapable of strategic withdrawal when survival demanded it. Caesar's greatest strength, his absolute refusal to accept limitations on his ambitions, had become his fatal weakness. He could not moderate his goals, could not compromise with his enemies, could not imagine that anyone would dare strike at him directly. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar was not the product of a single grievance or faction, but the convergence of multiple resentments and fears that his rule had created. The Ides of March, when gods bleed, the conspiracy against Julius Caesar, began not with a single moment of revelation, but with a gradual recognition among Rome's political elite that the man they had once merely opposed had become something far more dangerous, an existential threat to everything they understood as Roman civilization. By the winter of 45 BC, whispers in the shadows of the Senate House spoke not of political opposition, but of assassination, not of defeating Caesar, but of killing him. Marcus Junius Brutus was an unlikely leader for such a desperate enterprise. Descended from the Brutus who had expelled Rome's last king 5 centuries earlier, he was a man of impeccable reputation, philosophical training, and genuine devotion to republican ideals. Caesar had treated him not as an enemy, but as a surrogate son, pardoning him after Pharsalus, advancing his career, and trusting him with important responsibilities. Yet it was precisely this relationship that made Brutus's participation essential to the conspiracy's success and devastating to Caesar's survival. The other conspirators represented a cross-section of Roman society united only by their fear of Caesar's intentions and their desperation to prevent what they saw as the final destruction of republican government. Gaius Cassius Longinus, the conspiracy's practical organizer, was a veteran of the Parthian Wars who understood both the necessity of decisive action and the dangers of hesitation. Decimus Brutus, despite sharing a name with the conspiracy's moral leader, was actually one of Caesar's most trusted subordinates, a general who had served with distinction in Gaul and received considerable rewards for his loyalty. The inclusion of Decimus Brutus in the conspiracy revealed the depth of the alienation Caesar had created even among his closest supporters. Here was a man who owed his position, his wealth, and his reputation to Caesar's favor, yet who had concluded that Caesar's continued rule would destroy the very system that had elevated them both. It was a betrayal that cut to the heart of Caesar's political strategy, demonstrating that even gratitude and self-interest could not guarantee loyalty when survival seemed to require treachery. The conspirators faced an almost impossible challenge. They needed to kill the most powerful and best protected man in the Roman world while maintaining the appearance of acting for legitimate constitutional reasons. Caesar was surrounded by bodyguards, supported by devoted veterans, and possessed of an almost supernatural reputation for surviving dangerous situations. Moreover, his assassination would need to be presented not as murder, but as tyrannicide. Not as personal revenge, but as patriotic duty. Their solution required both careful planning and incredible courage. They would strike not in some dark alley or private home where Caesar might have few witnesses and limited protection, but in the Senate house itself, surrounded by Rome's most distinguished citizens, with Caesar's own colleagues participating in his destruction. The setting would legitimize their action, while the number of participants would make retaliation against any individual conspirator more difficult. The choice of the Ides of March 15th, 44 BC, was not random but calculated for maximum psychological impact. Caesar was scheduled to address the Senate one final time before departing for his Parthian campaign, and the conspirators understood that this represented their last opportunity to act before he left Rome for what might be years. More importantly, the Senate meeting would provide cover for their presence, while ensuring that Caesar would be relatively isolated from his most loyal supporters. The warnings that reached Caesar in the days before his death came from multiple sources and should have been impossible to ignore. A soothsayer named Spurina had warned him to beware the Ides of March. Advice Caesar had initially dismissed with his characteristic combination of skepticism and bravado. His wife, Calpurnia, had experienced nightmares about his death so vivid and disturbing that she begged him to stay home on March 15th. Anonymous notes appeared on his chair, warning of specific threats to his life. Perhaps most significantly, Caesar's own intelligence network had detected signs of unusual activity among known opponents. Conversations stopped when he approached. Meetings occurred in unusual locations and at odd hours, and several prominent senators had made excuses to avoid recent public appearances. For a man who had survived civil war through superior intelligence, gathering, and rapid response to threats, these signs should have prompted immediate protective measures. But Caesar's response to these warnings revealed how completely power had corrupted his judgment. He dismissed the soothsayer's advice as superstition, ignored his wife's pleas as feminine weakness, and treated anonymous warnings as the work of cowards who lacked the courage to confront him directly. Most fatally, he had dissolved his personal bodyguard, the Spanish cavalry that had protected him throughout the civil wars, declaring that a Roman leader should not need foreign mercenaries to guarantee his safety among his own citizens. This decision to dismiss his bodyguards was either an act of supreme confidence or supreme folly, depending on perspective. Caesar may have calculated that appearing fearful would damage his authority more than the actual risk to his person, or he may have genuinely believed that his clemency toward former enemies and his generosity toward supporters had eliminated serious threats to his life. Either way, the decision left him vulnerable at precisely the moment when vulnerability was most dangerous. The morning of March 15th found Caesar hesitant for the first time in his adult life. Calpurnia's dreams had been so disturbing that she renewed her pleas for him to postpone the Senate meeting, and Caesar apparently was inclined to grant her request. He sent word that illness would prevent his attendance, a lie that would have spared his life if he had maintained it. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and one of Caesar's most trusted friends, arrived at Caesar's house with a persuasive argument for attending the Senate meeting. He pointed out that the senators were prepared to offer Caesar additional honors, possibly including the title of king for his eastern territories. He suggested that postponing the meeting would be seen as an insult to the Senate and might jeopardize support for the Parthian expedition. Most effectively, He appealed to Caesar's pride, suggesting that the great conqueror of Gaul was allowing himself to be governed by a woman's dreams. Caesar's decision to attend the Senate meeting after initially planning to stay home was the final link in a chain of choices that stretched back to his youth. At every crucial moment of his life, when faced with a choice between safety and ambition, between caution and glory, Caesar had chosen the path that led toward greater power and greater risk. Now, with his life hanging in the balance, he made the same choice one last time. The walk to the Senate meeting that morning took Caesar past crowds of citizens who had no idea they were witnessing history's final moments. Some accounts suggest that he encountered Spurina, the soothsayer, who had warned him about the Ides of March, and remarked that the day had come without incident. Spurina's alleged reply, "I, Caesar, but not yet gone," captured the tension that filled Rome's streets as the morning progressed toward its bloody climax. The Senate was meeting in the Theatre of Pompey, a location rich with irony since it had been built by Caesar's greatest rival and bore his name throughout eternity. The building also housed a statue of Pompey himself, which would soon witness the death of the man who had destroyed him. Caesar's arrival at the theatre was marked by the usual ceremonies and courtesies, but several of the conspirators noted his apparent nervousness and wondered if their plot had been discovered. One final warning reached Caesar even as he entered the Senate chamber. A teacher named Artemidorus had prepared a detailed note listing the conspirators by name and describing their intentions, hoping to save Caesar's life through this desperate gamble. He pressed the note into Caesar's hands as he passed, urging him to read it immediately because it concerned his personal safety. But Caesar, surrounded by petitioners and distracted by the business of the day, handed the note to an aide without reading it, sealing his own fate through casual inattention. The assassination itself unfolded with shocking speed and brutality. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Tullius Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it from his shoulders, the prearranged signal for the attack to begin. Within seconds, 23 wounds had been inflicted by daggers wielded by Rome's most distinguished citizens, transforming the Senate floor into a slaughterhouse and the defenders of Republican liberty into common murderers. Caesar's resistance was brief but desperate. Initial accounts suggest he fought back, striking at his attackers with his stylus, the iron pen used for writing. But when he saw Marcus Brutus among his killers, the man he had treated as a son raising a dagger against him, Caesar reportedly spoke his final words. "Et tu, Brute. Then you too, Brutus." Whether historical fact or later invention, the phrase captured the essence of Caesar's final moments, not just physical agony, but the emotional devastation of ultimate betrayal. The conspirators had planned Caesar's death in meticulous detail, but they had given almost no thought to what would happen afterward. They had assumed that killing Caesar would automatically restore the Republic, that removing the tyrant would return Rome to its traditional constitutional government. Instead, Caesar's assassination created a power vacuum that threatened to tear the Roman world apart in renewed civil war. As Caesar's blood pooled around the base of Pompey's statue, the senators fled in panic, leaving the conspirators alone with their victim and their suddenly uncertain future. They had achieved their immediate goal, ending Caesar's life and his threat to Republican government. But in the hours and days that followed, it would become clear that they had solved nothing and had perhaps made everything immeasurably worse. The death of Julius Caesar marked not the restoration of the Roman Republic, but its final destruction. The system the conspirators had killed to preserve would not survive their victory. Instead, Caesar's assassination would unleash forces that would complete the transformation he had begun, establishing a monarchy more absolute and enduring than anything he had envisioned. The conspirators had succeeded in killing Caesar the man, but they had failed to kill what Caesar represented, the principle that individual ambition could transcend institutional limitations, that personal power could reshape entire civilizations, that the future belonged not to those who preserved traditions, but to those who possessed the vision and ruthlessness to create new ones. As Rome learned of Caesar's death and prepared for the chaos that would follow, one question dominated every conversation: what would happen now that the most powerful man in the world was gone? The answer would reshape the Roman world and echo through history for centuries to come. The aftermath, when giants fall, the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination revealed the conspiracy's fundamental flaw. They had planned a murder, but not a revolution. As Caesar's blood congealed on the Senate floor, the men who had killed him stood uncertain and afraid, clutching their daggers and wondering what to do next. They had imagined that Caesar's death would automatically restore republican government, that removing the tyrant would allow traditional institutions to resume their normal functions. Instead, they found themselves isolated in an empty Senate house while Rome exploded into chaos around them. Marcus Brutus attempted to address the fleeing senators, to explain the noble motives behind their action and rally support for republican restoration. But his philosophical speeches fell on empty air as terrified magistrates abandoned the building and rushed to safety. The conspirators had assumed that Caesar's death would be celebrated as liberation. Instead, it was received as catastrophe by citizens who had benefited from his rule and now faced an uncertain future. The first hours after the assassination demonstrated how completely Caesar had dominated Roman politics. Without his controlling presence, every institution seemed paralyzed, every official uncertain of his authority. The consuls, Caesar's subordinates, disappeared from public view. The urban praetor fled the city. Even the Senate, the institution the conspirators had killed to preserve, could not function without the man they had murdered to save it. But while the conspirators hesitated and the magistrates hid, others moved quickly to fill the vacuum Caesar's death had created. Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal lieutenant and co-consul for 44 BC, barricaded himself in his house and prepared for siege, assuming that the conspirators would attempt to eliminate Caesar's supporters as well as Caesar himself. When no attack came, when it became clear that the assassins had planned only murder and not systematic revolution, Antony began to calculate how Caesar's death might serve his own ambitions. The key to Rome's immediate future lay not in the hands of conspirators or magistrates, but in the possession of Caesar's private papers and personal fortune. Antony, as surviving consul, claimed the right to search Caesar's house and secure his documents. What he found there would determine whether Caesar's death marked the end of his influence or merely its transformation from personal to institutional power. Caesar's will, when finally read to the Roman people, delivered a posthumous blow to his assassins more devastating than any military defeat. Far from revealing the plans of a tyrant preparing to enslave Rome, the document showed a leader who had treated the Roman people as his heirs and beneficiaries. Every Roman citizen was left 300 sestertii, a substantial sum that represented months of wages for ordinary workers. Caesar's magnificent gardens across the Tiber were bequeathed to the people as a public park. Most surprisingly, Caesar had adopted as his son and heir his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, transforming an 18-year-old student into the richest and most powerful young man in Rome. The crowd's reaction to Caesar's will was immediate and violent. These were not the actions of a tyrant, but of a generous leader who had genuinely cared for his people's welfare. The citizens who had remained neutral during Caesar's lifetime now became passionate defenders of his memory, and their anger turned inevitably toward the men who had murdered their benefactor. The conspirators, who had expected gratitude for liberating Rome, found themselves hunted through the streets by mobs crying for vengeance. Caesar's funeral became the defining moment that transformed his assassination from political necessity to historical tragedy. Antony's funeral oration, delivered from the rostra before a crowd of thousands, was a masterpiece of political theatre that rivaled anything Caesar himself had ever staged. Standing over Caesar's bloodied corpse, displaying the toga with its 23 knife wounds, Antony read from Caesar's achievements and Caesar's generosity until the crowd was driven to frenzy. The violence that followed Caesar's funeral made clear that the republic the conspirators had killed to preserve was already dead. Mobs attacked the houses of Brutus and Cassius, forcing them to flee the city they had tried to save. Cinna, the poet, was torn apart by citizens who confused him with Cinna, the conspirator. The theatre where Caesar had been killed was burned to the ground, along with much of the surrounding neighborhood. Most significantly, the crowd erected an impromptu altar on the spot where Caesar's body had been burned and began offering sacrifices to his spirit. Within days of his death, Caesar was being worshipped as a god by the very people he had supposedly oppressed. The transformation from dictator to deity revealed how completely the conspirators had misjudged both Caesar's relationship with the Roman people and the nature of the system they were trying to restore. Young Octavius, soon to take the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus in honor of his adoption, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance just as the city was convulsing with grief and rage over his predecessor's death. At 18, he possessed neither military experience nor political connections. But he had something potentially more valuable: Caesar's name and Caesar's legacy. The boy who would become Augustus understood immediately that his adopted father's assassination had not ended the Caesarian cause, but had transformed it into something more powerful and more dangerous than it had ever been while Caesar lived. The political maneuvering that followed Caesar's death revealed the bankruptcy of traditional republican institutions when faced with the forces Caesar's career had unleashed. The Senate, supposedly restored to its rightful authority by the conspirators' action, proved incapable of governing effectively or maintaining order. Magistrates, elected through proper constitutional procedures, lacked the resources, the loyalty, and the vision necessary to address Rome's problems. Meanwhile, Caesar's veterans, scattered throughout Italy and the provinces, began to organize themselves for revenge against their commander's killers. These were professional soldiers whose loyalty belonged not to the Roman state, but to the man who had led them to victory and enriched them with plunder. Caesar's death did not release them from their obligations, but intensified them, transforming military loyalty into religious devotion. The emergence of multiple claimants to Caesar's legacy created the conditions for renewed civil war, even more destructive than the conflicts that had brought Caesar to power. Antony claimed authority as Caesar's political heir and surviving colleague. Octavian claimed legitimacy through legal adoption and testamentary designation. The conspirators claimed to represent constitutional government and traditional Roman values. Each faction possessed partial justification for their position, but none possessed the overwhelming superiority that could impose unity through strength alone. The conspiracy's failure became complete when Brutus and Cassius were forced to flee Italy altogether, abandoning the city they had killed to save to the very forces they had opposed. Their departure for the eastern provinces, where they hoped to build armies capable of defending Republican government, actually completed the destruction of the system they represented. They had become rebels against the established order, compelled to use the same methods of military coercion that they had condemned in Caesar. The second triumvirate, formed by Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus in 43 BC, represented Caesar's ultimate victory over his assassins. The three men who claimed his legacy divided the Roman world among themselves and began systematic elimination of their enemies through prescription lists that made Sulla's purges seem merciful by comparison. Cicero, the great orator who had celebrated Caesar's death as liberation, found his name on the lists and was hunted down and killed. His head and hands displayed on the rostra where he had once defended Republican government. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, where the armies of the Second Triumvirate destroyed the forces of Brutus and Cassius, marked the final defeat of the Republican cause. Both leading conspirators chose suicide over capture, understanding that their deaths would complete the transformation they had tried to prevent. Caesar's ghost, invoked by Octavian as divine justification for revenge, had triumphed over the men who had murdered Caesar's body. But perhaps the most telling measure of the conspiracy's failure was what happened to Caesar's name and memory in the decades following his death. Far from being remembered as a tyrant whose destruction had saved Rome, Caesar became the foundation myth of the imperial system that replaced the Republic. His name became the title of emperors, his achievements the model for imperial greatness, his clemency the standard for legitimate rule. The conspirators had succeeded in killing Julius Caesar, the man, but they had failed utterly to kill what Julius Caesar represented. His death had not ended the age of individual ambition and personal rule, but had inaugurated it permanently. The Roman Republic died with Caesar on the Ides of March, but the Roman Empire was born from his blood, destined to endure for centuries and to spread his name and his methods across the known world. The eternal Caesar, legacy of ambition, Julius. Caesar died on March 15th, 44 BC, but in many ways he had already achieved the immortality he sought. His assassination, intended to end his influence over Roman civilization, instead ensured that his name would echo through history long after his body had returned to dust. The conspirators who killed him, believing they were saving the Republic, actually completed the transformation he had begun, creating the very monarchy they had murdered him to prevent. Caesar's most immediate legacy was political, the imperial system that would govern Rome for the next 5 centuries. His adoptive son, Octavian, who took the name Augustus after his victory over Antony and Cleopatra, understood that Caesar's greatest mistake had been moving too quickly toward open monarchy. Augustus preserved republican forms while exercising imperial power, calling himself merely first citizen while functioning as absolute ruler. This compromise between tradition and innovation, between constitutional appearance and monarchical reality, proved durable enough to survive weak emperors, civil wars, and barbarian invasions. But Caesar's influence extended far beyond political institutions. His literary works, particularly the commentaries on the Gallic Wars, established a new standard for historical writing that combined military analysis with political propaganda. Written in the third person with apparent objectivity, the commentaries presented Caesar's version of events in prose so elegant and convincing that it shaped historical understanding of his campaigns for 2 millennia. Schoolchildren throughout the Roman Empire learned Latin by reading Caesar's accounts of his own achievements, ensuring that each new generation would view him as the model of Roman greatness. Caesar's military innovations proved equally enduring. His reforms of legion, organization, siege warfare, and logistical systems became standard practice throughout the imperial period. His emphasis on speed, flexibility, and engineering superiority influenced Roman military doctrine long after the Gallic Wars had ended. More importantly, Caesar's demonstration that personal loyalty could be more valuable than institutional authority transformed the interrelationship between commanders and soldiers throughout the Roman world. The transformation of Caesar into a god after his death revealed the most profound change his career had brought to Roman civilization. Traditional Roman religion had honored abstract virtues and ancestral spirits, but Caesar's deification established the precedent for treating living emperors as divine beings worthy of worship and sacrifice. The imperial cult that developed around Caesar and his successors became one of Rome's most powerful tools for maintaining unity across its vast territories, providing a common focus of loyalty that transcended local traditions and ethnic divisions. Perhaps most significantly, Caesar's career established ambition itself as a legitimate and necessary force in human affairs. Pre-Caesarian Rome had valued moderation, collective decision-making, and respect for precedent. Caesar demonstrated that individual vision and determination could achieve results impossible through traditional methods. His success inspired countless imitators throughout Roman history, men who sought to emulate his rise to power while avoiding his fate. The month of July, renamed from Quinctilius in Caesar's honor, serves as a daily reminder of his continuing presence in human consciousness. The Julian calendar he introduced, with minor modifications, still governs daily life throughout most of the world. Every time we note the date or planned future events, we participate in Caesar's reorganization of time itself. His calendar reform, practical and enduring, may be his most ubiquitous legacy, affecting more people more regularly than his political or military achievements. Caesar's name became the ultimate symbol of supreme power, adopted by rulers who had no connection to Rome or its traditions. The German Kaiser and Russian Tsar derived their titles directly from Caesar, claiming his authority across cultures and centuries. Even leaders who rejected Roman precedents often found themselves compared to Caesar when their ambitions exceeded traditional limitations. The moral complexity of Caesar's legacy has fascinated historians, philosophers, and political theorists for 2 millennia. He was simultaneously liberator and oppressor, genius and destroyer, visionary and megalomaniac. His clemency toward defeated enemies contrasted with his ruthless elimination of constitutional barriers. His genuine care for ordinary Romans conflicted with his systematic destruction of the institutions that had protected their rights. This complexity makes Caesar eternally relevant to discussions of leadership, power, and the relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare. Democratic societies that fear excessive executive power invoke Caesar as a warning about the dangers of personal rule. Authoritarian regimes seeking historical legitimacy claim Caesar as a model of decisive leadership and effective governance. His career provides evidence for almost any political position, which explains his continuing relevance across ideological divisions. Caesar's literary influence extends far beyond his own writings. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar made him one of the most recognizable figures in world literature, familiar to audiences who know nothing else about Roman history. The play's exploration of political assassination personal loyalty, and the tension between private conscience and public duty has resonated with every generation since its composition. Countless other works of fiction, drama, and poetry have drawn on Caesar's life for themes and inspiration. The archaeological legacy of Caesar's conquests continues to emerge from European soil 2,000 years after his death. Roman roads, fortifications, and cities throughout France, Britain, Germany, and Spain testify to the permanent changes his campaigns brought to these regions. The Romanization process he began transformed tribal societies into urban civilizations, spreading Latin language, Roman law, and Mediterranean culture across territories that had previously existed outside the classical world. Modern military academies still study Caesar's campaigns as examples of strategic and tactical excellence. His crossing of the Rubicon has become synonymous with irreversible decision-making, while his Gallic wars demonstrate principles of logistics, intelligence, gathering, and psychological warfare that remain relevant to contemporary military thinking. The fact that officers 20 centuries later can learn practical lessons from Caesar's methods suggests the timeless quality of his military genius. Caesar's economic policies, particularly his approach to debt relief and public works projects, anticipated modern theories about government's role in stimulating economic activity during periods of stagnation. His understanding that political stability required addressing the material needs of ordinary citizens, not just the privileges of elites, foreshadowed later developments in political economy and social policy. The conspiracy that killed Caesar has itself become a paradigm for understanding political assassination and its consequences. The gap between the conspirators' intentions and the results they achieved illustrates the difficulty of predicting how violence will affect complex political systems. Their failure to plan beyond Caesar's death, their assumption that killing the man would automatically restore the system he had displaced, offers lessons about the relationship between individuals and institutions that remain relevant to contemporary political analysis. But perhaps Caesar's most important legacy is the demonstration that individual human beings can fundamentally alter the course of civilization through force of personality, intelligence, and will. His life proved that historical change need not be gradual or inevitable, that determined individuals can compress decades of development into years of action. This lesson has inspired revolutionaries, entrepreneurs, and reformers throughout history, people who believed that existing systems could be transformed through ambitious leadership. The price of such transformation, as Caesar's death demonstrated, is often paid by the transformer himself. His assassination illustrates the dangers facing anyone who attempts to reshape established institutions, the resistance that greets efforts to concentrate power for supposedly beneficial purposes. Yet the ultimate success of Caesar's vision, despite his personal destruction, suggests that historical forces may be more powerful than the individuals who embody them. As we stand more than 2 millennia after Caesar's birth, his influence on human civilization remains undeniable. Legal systems throughout the world show traces of Roman law that Caesar helped to spread. Languages from Spanish to Romanian preserve Latin roots that his conquests carried across Europe. Political systems everywhere struggle with the same tensions between individual leadership and collective governance that Caesar's career brought to crisis. The man who began as a detritan young aristocrat and ended as master of the Mediterranean world achieved a kind of immortality that transcends physical death. His name echoes through history not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of human ambition in its most concentrated and dangerous form. Julius Caesar died on the Ides of March, but the forces he unleashed, the precedents he established, and the questions he raised about power and leadership continue to shape human affairs. Tonight, as we conclude this journey through the life and death of Rome's most controversial figure, we are left with the same questions that faced Romans in 44 BC. What is the proper relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare? How much power should any single person be allowed to wield? When does necessary leadership become dangerous tyranny? Caesar's life offers no simple answers to these questions, but it demonstrates their eternal importance. His story reminds us that the hunger for power, the desire to reshape the world according to personal vision, remains one of the most potent and dangerous forces in human affairs. The man who crossed the Rubicon with a single legion ultimately conquered more than territories and enemies. He conquered time itself, ensuring that his name would be remembered when the marble statues of his contemporaries had crumbled to dust. But the price of that immortality was paid not only by Caesar himself, bleeding out on the Senate floor, but by the republic that had created him, and the countless lives lost in the wars that followed his death. As we witness the rise of new leaders, who promise to break old systems and forge new realities, as we watch ambitious individuals accumulate power that transcends traditional limitations, the ghost of Julius Caesar walks among us still. His life remains a warning about the seductive nature of absolute power and a reminder that those who live by ambition may ultimately die by it. But it also stands as testament to the extraordinary heights that human determination can reach when freed from conventional constraints. Caesar's tragedy was not that he aimed too high, but that he forgot the very lessons his own rise had taught. That in politics, as in war, victory is never permanent, and that today's friends may become tomorrow's assassins. The Ides of March came and went in 44 BC, but the questions Caesar's life and death raised about power, ambition, and the price of greatness echo through history into our own time. His story is far from over, because as long as humans dream of reshaping the world in their own image, as long as ambition burns in human hearts, the spirit of Julius Caesar lives on. The die was cast more than 2,000 years ago, but we are still living with the consequences, and perhaps in our own leaders and in ourselves. We can still see the shadow of that young Roman who refused to accept limitations, who crossed every river and conquered every enemy, until finally there were no more worlds to conquer except the one that destroyed him. The hearts and minds of those who had the power to say no tonight. In whatever corner of the world you find yourself, remember that the choice between freedom and tyranny, between collective wisdom and individual will, between the safety of tradition and the danger of transformation, remains as relevant now as it was on that blood-soaked morning when the Roman Republic died with the man who had outgrown it. Julius Caesar achieved his immortality, but at a cost that echoes through the ages. His ambition elevated him to godhood, but it also taught us the eternal truth that no mortal, however brilliant or powerful, can transcend the fundamental limitations of human nature and political reality. The senators' knives found their mark, but Caesar's legacy proved immune to assassination in the end. Perhaps that is the most chilling lesson of his extraordinary life, that some ambitions are too great to die with the men who conceive them, and that the most dangerous leaders are those whose influence grows stronger in death than it ever was in life. Good night.